It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, Mr. Walter Allen. Mr. Allen has written several books.
Get your life straight.
Is there more in the...
Yes.
All right. So, Mr. Allen, an evening with Mr. Walter Allen.
Okay, now that that's over, what do y'all want to talk about? I do want to thank Thomas and the museum for allowing me this opportunity to share with you some of the ideas and information that I have learned over the course of the last 15 years. I also want to thank a special group that's here tonight to support me. I appreciate that. The VIP group from First Baptist Church in Clinton. Thank you for coming out tonight. A little bit of information about myself before I get into the topic. I'm retired, trying to start another career, as you mentioned, writing. I'm retired from the paper industry. I was involved with that for about 37 years. One of my interests and one of my hobbies is to participate in living history reenactments. I've been to Camden, Walnut Grove, 96, Musgrove Mill State Historic Site, and some individual locations in the past. I do volunteer at the Lawrence County Museum, volunteer at Musgrove Mill State Historic Site, and Joanna Woodson Elementary School, which is, I think, one of the finest schools in the state. And I see some nods from retired teachers, so very good, very good. Before I get into the detail about the development of townships in Colonial, South Carolina, I want to give you a brief history lesson on two subjects. One is land ownership, and the other is surveying. So get your pencil and paper out, because it's going to be on your test. The concept of land ownership, that was something that did not exist years ago. And I'm going to go back as far as 1492. What happened that year? A lot of things happened, and that is a significant event in world history. But land, in the 2 centuries preceding 1492 and in the 2 centuries after it, land ownership was not defined the way we think of it today. It was defined in terms of political usage, political terms. Terms such as kingdoms, territories, and nations. A ruler or a monarch might claim ownership, but individuals owning land was something that was unheard of during that time frame. It was the king's land. It was the king's forest. It was the king's deer, wildlife. And that school of thought, or that idea of thinking, was not restricted or limited just to Europe during that time period. To some extent, that same thinking was over here in the New World, even before the New World was discovered. An example of that would be the Native Americans. The Delaware would live on the land. The Iroquois would occupy it. The Miami would pass through it. And the Cherokee over here would have some hunting grounds they would use or claim as theirs. But an individual owning land was unheard of. It might be that if you lived back then and you were speaking to 2 Native Americans and you asked them who owned this land, they wouldn't know how to answer you. It would be like two fleas arguing over who owned the dog. So land to be thought of as property belonging to an individual, a commodity that could be traded, borrowed against, or speculated, would require a fundamental shift in thinking. And that started when Columbus, not when he discovered it, the New World, but when he got back. This fundamental shift also was influenced by a book that was written. You know, some people just write books when they get a chance, and some of them are pretty good to read, and some of them are entitled, "This book shows the measuring of all manner of land." But in 1538, an Englishman, Sir Richard Bernice, wrote that book. This book shows the measuring of all manner of lands. That was the title of the book. So why was it considered necessary, or why did that happen? Well, when you measure land, you give it value. That makes sense? Pieces of land became units of economic value. Previous measurements of land were done by metes and bounds. By a show of hands, do you know what metes and bounds is in measuring land? Well, okay, I can tell you most anything. Metes and bounds was a system of measuring land used in Europe during this time period, before Columbus and after Columbus. And in particular, and I like to use the country France because there's a little bit of significance there. This king who claimed ownership of the land, this kingdom, or any other monarch or a noble, landed, wealthy person, would hire an individual and give him a job, and that job title was overseer. An overseer would walk what was believed to be the property lines of the kingdom, looking for anybody that's poaching on the land, stealing from it, living there that had no business being there. That was the overseer's job, and he would do that about 4 times a year. So getting back to why is it metes and bounds? Well, it was defined, property lines were defined by geographical features. My property meets Leon's in the south by Wilderness Creek. My property is bounded on the north by Sherwood Forest. Geographical features determine property lines. And of course you enforce that with any means possible. But the reason I selected the country France was there are 2 French words that when combined make up the word overseer. But the French word for overseer is surveyor. So that's where we get the term from, surveyor. So, measuring land makes it an economic unit of value. And in those colonial times in Europe, property lines were determined by the metes and bounds system, which carried over to the New World. So this book that Sir Richard Bernice wrote described how to measure land. So would anybody have an idea how you would define an acre of land in 1538? Well, there's several schools of thought on that subject. One of them is, how much land can a single ox plow in one day? So that's very subjective, is it not? If you've got a rocky terrain, trees in the way, or how old is the ox? Okay, so that's not very accurate in doing that. Another way of defining what an acre of land during this time period is how much land it would take to support a family. Okay, is it just a man and a wife? Or do they have 17 kids? So it was very subjective in how land was measured. But this book comes out and says how to do it. But an acre had still not yet been clearly defined and be consistent. But in the year 1620, and all this, folks, is leading up to townships, giving you a little background. But in 1620, another Englishman by the name of Edwin invented a measuring chain. And it carries his name today, Gunner's chain. And he made it out of metal, and he made it 66 feet long. And I have one over here that you can look at later. Now, for demonstration purposes for these living history events, I use what is called a half chain, 33 feet. But he made his 66 feet, and there was a reason for that. There was a unit of measurement that was already in existence at that time, and it was called a rod. Have you heard that before? How long is a rod? 16 and a half feet. So that's kind of an unusual number. And how did a rod become established as a unit of measurement? It was a wooden pole, 16 and a half feet. Well, King James called his, there's one school of thought, there's several different ideas of how things evolved. But there's one where King James called his advisors into the court and said, okay, we need a standard unit of measurement. So go to the cathedral and pick the first 12 men that come out and line them up heel toe. And whatever distance that is, we're going to use. That's not documented as accurate, but it makes for a good story. So this unit of measurement, 66 feet, incorporated the known unit of a rod. So you take 66 feet in this chain and you stretch it out 10 times. And at the end of that 10, you make a right angle and you stretch it out one time. That's 2 sides of an acre. So that standardized the measurement of an acre. 660 feet by 66 feet. And that made it easy. So that's about 43,000 square feet. Okay, how does this tie in with townships? Well, what happened when Columbus discovered this new world and went back to Spain and said, hey folks, look what I found? People wanted to come over. And the people that first came after Columbus were the additional explorers. Then came the map makers or surveyors. And then came the settlers. And they came by the thousands. They were communists. Because when the colony of Carolina was formed, the king told 8 men, the Lord proprietors, you're going to be the administrators of it. But there's an economic opportunity over here in this colony, and we want to get a profit from it. So you got to have people to work. So people were offered land. The head of the family would get 100 acres. Each member of the family would get 50 acres. If you would agree to go over there, work the land, pay a rent from your produce, and then that would create an economy. So the Lord proprietors initiated this, or they offered this opportunity to get to the new world for a lot of people by doing that. So in Colonial, South Carolina, there was the land our townships were established. This is my PowerPoint presentation. So what is a township? It's a land management system. Okay? It is also a piece of land containing approximately 20,000 to 23,000 acres of land. And if some of you keep records like I do, you may pull out your old voter registration card, and it may have on there what township you're registered to vote in. Barry, you're nodding your hand, you remember that?
Yeah, I remember, yes.
It's not on mine now. I think it's been removed, but I can remember it being on one I had back in the 70s. So, a township basically is two things. It is a land management system, and it is a piece of land. Now, what is the purpose of putting these up here? Well, first of all, between 1731 and 1765, there were 12 townships surveyed in Colonial, South Carolina. So what is the purpose of this? Why is the colonial governor having this done? Well, take notice of where they are. Are they down here on the coastline? So back then, we call this the Midlands now, but back then it was the Western Frontier. Okay? So there were basically two reasons that townships were established. People moving into here were the most recent settlers coming in. The ones that came before them settled in the coastal towns. Charleston, Port Royal, all along here. And I don't want to offend anybody, but there was a point in time when these people down here thought they were a little bit better than these folks up here. So I hope nobody's from Charleston. But there was a little bit of that attitude. So let's put some townships in this area so that when the Native Americans do attack, they're going to attack these people. And there will be a buffer zone to protect us from down here. Now you notice there's one down here. This is on the Savannah River. And would you believe that the Spanish were a threat back then? So this one was put there for the Spanish. Okay. Now, this one was populated, and when I say populated, most of 50% plus one of the settlers that went into this, and this one was Perrysburg Township. Most of, about 50% plus one, I guess, were French coming in here. Okay? Then you come up here later, and several years later, you've got the French in 1764 at the Hillsborough Township. Does that name ring a bell to anybody? Okay. Then you've got London Borough Township, and this was the Palatine Germans.
Those were my ancestors.
Hillsborough? Or
No,
Londonborough?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Palatine Germans. What does that suggest?
Religious freedom.
They might be Jews. Heritage. Okay. Saxe Gotha. Germans. This township was created in the 1740s. 1730s, the township of Orangeburg and Amelia. This is two of them back to back. The Germans. Okay. Not all of them, but mostly populated there. These others were mixed English and a variety of others. Now, what else do you notice about the township in these areas? On my excellent artwork.
Waterways.
Waterways. They're located on the river systems. That was the highways back then. And if it was deep enough and wide enough to put a flat barge on it, they could transport produce goods, hides. Okay, so a buffer zone was one of the purposes for creating townships. The other purpose was, we got a lot of people coming. And we got to have a system in place to record and document who's getting what and how much of that they're getting. Because if I moved in and settled on a certain number of acres, then I want it to go to my family and my grandchildren. So it has to be documented. It has to be recorded. So that was the second reason you can manage it that way. So where did the idea for a township originate from? It originated from a colonel in the British Army. And that colonel was named John Barnwell. Now, does that name ring a bell? Barnwell County? Okay. He came up with this idea. But he didn't have the authority or the power to implement it. So Governor Robert Johnson of the Carolina Assembly, come on in, folks. Come on in. Governor Robert Johnson of Carolina implemented the land management system in 1730. That's going back a ways. Okay? Now, let's look at townships a little bit more in detail. My next slide. If you'll well, before I put it up though, if you'll notice, some of them appear larger than others. That's why I said that it was approximately 20,000 to 23,000 acres. Well, there was not a complete standard for that at this time. It was roughly 6 miles by 6 miles. But that became the official standard later. And this is what it would look like. And this is northeast, northwest, southwest, and southeast. But a township, even back in those days, it may not have been a perfect square because some of the borderlines followed the contour of the river. Okay. But the ones that looked square were 6 miles. And those in that time period in the colony were not necessarily oriented north, south, east, west. They might have been turned at an angle. But they became north and south and east and west later. And they were always numbered. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And they would start in the northeast corner and come to the west. Drop down south and go back. These are 1 mile sections right here. And you see where section 16 is? Almost in the center. A lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times, section 16 was reserved for public schools. So that's what a town, and we're going to look at this in more detail in a few minutes, but townships were surveyed along meridians of longitude and meridians of latitude. Okay. Now, you take one of those sections and you've got 640 acres in one section. So if you ever watch an old movie, Western movie, and some fella says, I've got a section of land over here by the river. Now, is he talking about 1 or 2 acres? If he uses the word section, he's talking about 640 acres. That's a lot more land than I've got. But back then, it was probably what it took to run a decent cattle ranch or whatever. But 640 acres is one section. So if you half that, you do the math. 3 310, you have it again, 160, 80 acres, 40 acres. You can divide it smaller than that, but when you get below 10 acres, it's divided into lots. So you can actually, today, on modern GPS, if you want to find out where 40 acres are in a certain township, put in the coordinates and then tell you. Now, anytime you have 7 townships in a row, that's called a range. Okay. So you got 40 acres here. Now I need to ask you this question. You get extra points on the test if you get this right. Have you ever heard of the phrase 40 acres and a mule? Everybody, do you know where it comes from? I'll give you a hint. It's not colonial times. What?
Didn't the carpetbaggers give?
Now you're close. You're very close to that.
I must go with the winds on the roof.
The township would have been divided in 40 acres if you needed it for that purpose. But at the end of this, was it the war between the states, the Civil War, or the War of Yankee aggression? I don't know, but it's that war that was fought between 1861 and 65. Near the end of that war, and I'm going to go back to this map, near the end of that war, in January of 1865, after William Tecumseh Sherman had made his march to the sea, when he got there to the sea, he issued what is called Field Order number 15. Have you heard of that? Well, it was a lengthy order, but contained in that order, and Abraham Lincoln approved it. What was contained in that order? That certain lands from Charleston down to Savannah area and 30 miles inland would be confiscated by the federal government because it belonged to the Confederates. So that period, and that land was going to be distributed to freed slaves. Okay. Now, in that distribution of that, each family of freed slaves would get 40 acres. Okay. But that's all they got. They didn't have much. Just think about the living conditions back then. So Sherman's army had a lot of mules. And he told his captains, go lend them a mule so they could farm it. So that's where we get the 40 acres and a mule phrase from. Any questions so far? Yes.
Just a comment. My wife's ancestors along that area followed the war, lost all their land, and it was 40 acres.
Is that right? There's probably a lot of folks that have some ancestors that have similar stories like that. Now, for the audience participation part. Leon, can I get you out in here? Yeah. You see what the back of this looks like? That's my wife's sewing board. But it's the only piece I could find big enough and that would fold up. We're going to hold it up vertical. We got to turn it around, don't we? All right, here we go. All right, just let it rest on the floor for just a minute. So stand. Let me get this other map up here. All right. We're going to hold this up. Let's see if we can't just sit it right here like this. This is one of my birthday presents. My wife gave me several years ago. And you can see, well, hopefully, can you see it, Durant?
Yes, I see it.
You can see that we've got the 13 original colonies, and then, of course, some states that came in very shortly thereafter the end of the war. Tennessee, Kentucky. And there's But I've got a little orange marker right here. And this orange marker is pointing to a current city or town of East Liverpool, Ohio. Now I want to tell you the significance of this, because at the end of the war, not only did the United States gain their independence, they gained all this land east of the Mississippi. Now if I fought in that war and survived it and lived to be the age I am now, retired, I would be entitled to a war pension. But just like Congress today, Congress back then didn't have a lot of money, but they did have a lot of land. So a lot of pensions were paid off by giving land. And the Congress says, well, we don't know how much we got. There goes back to that economic value again. Okay? So, they hired this fellow named Thomas Hutchins in 1785, gave him the title Surveyor General of the United States. And they told him, go survey the western lands, we need to know what we got. Where would you start? East Liverpool, Ohio. That's where he started. He just said, okay, you're giving me this freedom to pick and choose, that's where I'm going. And the town is still there today. There's a historical marker because the actual monument that he built is underwater now. Flood control for the Ohio. But there's a historical marker about 200 feet from him telling the significance of that. But now if you look, and he worked on this project for 5 years. But now if you look, can you see the tiny grid work going all the way to the Pacific Ocean? That's public lands. And every one of them, all of it, was surveyed in townships. So if you get on an airplane and you fly over that, going to California, and you look down and you see that the fence lines and the county roads look like they're at right angles, it has some influence on that. Okay.
How many people do we have to do that?
Well, that's a good question. How many people did Thomas Hutchins have? I don't know exactly, but when I do Colonial demonstrations of surveying, I tell people you need at least 4. But the more you've got, the less work each individual has to do. You need the surveyor himself, of course. You need at least 2 chain bearers, and then somebody to maintain the camp and do the cooking. And but if you've got more than 4, you can work a little faster. And are you?
Yep. Yeah, I was just going to say that I have a lot of family in the Midwest and stuff like that, and what you're saying actually makes a lot of sense to me, because the places, there are still townships in the Midwest. They're still called townships, and they're very well known. For instance, the one where my mom is from, Sandusky Township in Ohio, right? And they probably have like maybe 4 or 5 cities in them on average. Usually really small towns and stuff like that, but yeah, I mean, I guess.
You ever go back to visit?
Oh yeah, all the time.
Find out where the public schools are. Just as a point of interest.
They're in the town. They're often associated with like with the township itself, I guess. I mean, I never really thought about where stuff was in the township, but I always thought it was interesting that they have townships and we apparently don't. You know what I mean?
Well, at one time we did, but South Carolina seems to have gotten away from it. But remember again that it was established, or this township idea was established as a land management system. You got a flood of people coming from Europe. And then the secondary reason is we need somebody to protect us from the native inhabitants. So those were the two basic reasons for that happening. Any other questions, comments? Yes, sir.
I grew up in Greenville County and Cleveland County, North Carolina. There weren't any townships before Reconstruction and occupation. Townships at that time were imposed on us.
Really?
It was northern concept. And in Cleveland County, North Carolina, there were townships 1 through 10, and township number 3 was never known. And where did you live? You lived in number 3 township. Where did you go to school? Number 3 school. They never had a name. All the other ones got names.
Wow. Sounds like maybe there's a story there. Yes,
I'm just curious, was there ever a time when the Carolinas were just one Carolina?
yes,
Well,
yes.
how did North and South separate? How did that happen?
Couldn't get along. I don't know. I don't really know a definitive answer to that question, why we have 2 Carolinas. But initially, it was one colony land grant. And it was from near where the current North Carolina northern border is, down to the northern Florida area. And it went all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Because, but of course, it never happened. The colony got smaller and smaller and smaller. But as to why, and possibly it might have had to do with economic development, because if you notice where the northern boundary of South Carolina is, along just a little bit south, I believe, the Cape Fear River, that was a established port of entry and for commerce, and it may have been just an economic difference that established and started that way. And that's speculation on my part. Yes, sir.
So they don't use the term townships anymore in South Carolina, do they?
Not to my knowledge.
Like how we do up in New Jersey, Rock Island, and the east side of the Midwest, but they don't do it around here. And why not?
I don't have a good answer for that. I'm not going to make something up why it's not used anymore. I just know it didn't show up on my voter's registration card. But at one time it was.
If I'm not mistaken, where we are there, it was Hunter's Township.
I remember Hunters, and across on the northern side of 385 in Clinton, it was Schofield Township.
That's right.
Yes, sir. Somebody else, you have a question?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think that I'm just guessing here, but a lot of the land in the Midwest is much flatter, and it's also not just flat, but it's but like a lot of the roads, most of the roads up there, especially in the farm country, are like, very straight lines, squares, everything like that, so, and a lot of the townships look a lot like that, just big squares, and they're just subdivisions of counties, you know what I mean?
Yes. Yes.
So there might be like 8 townships in one county or something like that.
Well, the further west you go, I know that there's some counties bigger than some of our smaller states. They're pretty big. I think I was watching a documentary about Montana. Got some counties that are pretty big.
Mm-hmm. I think there's some counties that are bigger than South Carolina. Maybe? I don't know.
I don't know.
Well, back to the thing about North Carolina, South Carolina splitting.
Yes.
About 3 or 4 years ago, they changed one of the borders up around the Rock Hill, Fort Mill, Charlotte area.
Mm-hmm. Had to do with the, I think it was having to do with the claims by Native Americans that descended from those areas.
That's right, I believe too.
Yes, sir.
The story of the border between North and South Carolina is a fascinating one, and it gives a lot of history about our state and North Carolina. Now, Carolina was a unified colony up until 1730, and the Lords Proprietors were not good managers of the colony of Carolina, and it was felt that, for one, that the colony was just too big. So the king took it over in 1730. And at that point, he decreed a border between North and South Carolina. And the border was supposed to start 30 miles south, right there, 30 miles south of the mouth of the Cape Fear River. And it was to proceed north-west until it reached the 35th parallel. And from the 35th parallel, it went all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But they hired a surveyor to survey this line right here, northwest from this point, 30 miles south of the Cape Fear River. And so the fella started surveying, and he got to right there. Now there's a couple of stories. One story is that they ran out of money and the guy didn't get paid anymore, so he stopped right there. The other story is he ran into a moonshine still. But, so for years, that was the point, and then they realized they needed to, go further west on the 35th parallel. In the meantime, they had given 15 square miles right here to the Catawba Indians because they were friendly to the settlers, and the Catawbas, were rewarded with 225 square miles of a reservation. So the survey starts again. It's supposed to go due west. They start right here at this point, and they go due west until they ran smack dab into the Catawba Indian Reservation. When that 15 square miles was surveyed, they had no points of reference. They did not know exactly where it was. Well, what they did realize is that this point right here is not the 35th parallel. It stopped 11 miles short of the 35th parallel because of the liquor still, and that line was supposed to go straight across through here. But when they hit the Catawba Indian Reservation, they went, well, what do we do now? Then they kind of stopped. And then they had fits and starts and everything. Lord Tryon in 1776 drew a line which is the eastern boundary of Greenville County and Spartanburg. Lord Tryon drew this line and claimed all of this area for North Carolina. The governor of North Carolina, Lord Tryon, drew the property line between Greenville County and Spartanburg County. And there was a case in London, a court case over that, starting in 1766. It wasn't until 1772 that the court in London, the verdict came back that what Lord Tryon had done was, illegal, ridiculous, we're throwing that out. So then they reestablished areas here. Part of it is being North Carolina and part of it is South Carolina. And as a result of that, South Carolina picked up this area here, which is called the New Acquisition. The border between South Carolina and North Carolina crosses the 35th parallel in only 2 spots. It was supposed to be continuous. If that line had been maintained, Marietta would have been in North Carolina. But the story of the property lines are fascinating. The story of the Greenville County property line is fascinating. But it tells an awful lot about the history of our state.
What was the motivation, though, for the division? I mean,
Money.
Economics.
And was the impetus for that from South Carolina, or did the impetus come from?
I think they just realized it was just too big to handle. There wasn't, and basically the king took it over from the Lord's proprietors because he wasn't getting, his interests weren't being served. But it was a big area.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
So, now Thomas has said that are there any more questions first? Comments?
I got a quick question. I've always wondered, when does a town become a city?
I think that's determined by population.
Is it population?
I'm not sure what the cutoff mark is. Sir, you may know?
I just moved from the town of Lexington South Carolina. About 25,000 people in it. To the city of Travelers Rest with half that.
So it's a little bit of pride.
I think it has to do with the form of government that they use.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure if in the state of Alabama, it's population that determines whether you're going to call it a city or a town. So anyway, he has said that I could mention my book, The Adventures of Robert Steele, and this is it's historical fiction, and it's about my ancestor. Except I have made a change about the setting of him. He originally arrived in Charlestown in 1768 with his wife and 3 kids. I have changed that part of his life. I have made him a 16-year-old coming to the New World on a ship. He's traveling alone, and his father has signed a contract for him to be an indentured servant in Charlestown. So he finds his master in Charlestown, who assigns him to a land surveyor. And it's about a 16-year-old boy making his way in the New World, coming of age, learning about the wilderness. He sees alligators for the first time in his life, and he calls them monsters. He sees a snake and calls it a stick that's come alive. He has to learn the trade of surveying. And one point that I want to mention too about all of the surveying that went on, if you were a Cherokee warrior in this time period and you're out hunting and you're in the middle of a thicket and being real quiet, and all of a sudden you take a step and you find yourself in an open area that as far as you can see, the bush has been cut down in this direction. And no explanation that you can think of why there would be a straight line of open view or open sight in both directions. So after a while, the Cherokee and other Native Americans begin to realize that their hunting grounds was being divided up for white folks to come in and settle on it. So what does that make the surveyor in relation to the Cherokee or the other Indians? Enemies. So that train of thought, I entered it into as an episode in the book. They get captured. Robert Steele gets captured, and he's basically got a language barrier and a culture barrier. And he's trying to understand what they're asking, and he's trying to explain why they're here, and he's not sure of the outcome. So he and his friend said, "We got to get away." So they escape. I'm working on the sequel to it. I have some up here if you're interested. They're available, $16, and check or cash. I can't take a credit card. But if there are no further questions, then I appreciate you coming and asking and participating with questions and comments. Thank you.